All right, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. Hey, welcome to your second Innovate LLC integration event on climate change. Just a couple of things before we get started. Remember the Zoom etiquette that hopefully all of your professors, especially your LLC professors, have already talked to you about. So take a moment to settle in, make sure that your microphone is muted. All right, whether or not you have your video on or off is up to you, but make sure your microphone is muted. All right. Please also open up the chat area on your Zoom screen. And if you have questions or comments or want to say anything, go ahead and put it in there. Now, sometimes with my screen shared right now, it's very possible that you're like, wait, but if I have my chat open, I can't see the whole slide. Well, it turns out that if you hit escape, then you can actually make the presentation not take up your full screen, and you can make it smaller so that you can actually see the chat function. All right, chat and the presentation. Okay, it's not doing it. There we go. Okay, so today there are four professors, possibly from somewhat disparate disciplines here. I'm Professor Morse. I'm in biology. I teach in our LLC on genomes and evolution. I'm going to let everybody else introduce themselves, but you'll see that we have someone who will talk with you about literature, chemistry, communication studies. We're going to start with a little bit of doom and gloom and downer. So I'm the biologist, and I actually study biological diversity. Climate change has a really serious impact on the natural world. Now, our interaction with the natural world, I think, is very important to us psychologically, socially, emotionally, and we'll talk about that a little bit here. So I'm going to talk about conservation. I'm going to talk about something called biome evolution, especially as it relates to California and what is going on right now, as you can see in this picture. If you are living in a cave, you will not know that California is currently on fire, but it is. We're going to see these things, including climate change, as a one-way street from a biologist and from a biodiversity perspective. And I'm going to start with some charismatic megafauna. So I have to start with something that just makes you guys go, aww. And this is a North American montane pika. These guys are, in my opinion, one of the cutest animals on the planet. And they exist exclusively in alpine environments at high altitudes. And it turns out that as the annual minimum and maximum in their habitats increases, it alters their range in a very, very particular way. So if we think about this, these guys are on mountaintops. Here's their current distribution right here in red. And you can see, you could do an outline of the Sierra Nevadas, you could do an outline of the Cascades, you could do an outline of the Wasatch Range and of the Colorado Rockies up through the Northern Rockies. And that's the range of the America's pika. All right, now with 1 degree increase, that range decreases. With 2 degrees, it keeps popping out and keeps popping out and keeps popping out. And you can see, just kind of blur your eyes a little bit. You can see that the pika is disappearing from the landscape. 2 very, very unique populations have already disappeared, and those are in Utah. If you have ever been to the Utah National Parks or to ski at Bryan Head, the populations on Cedar Breaks and the populations in Arches are gone. They went extinct by 2018. So climate change has real effects, right? It's not just some in the cloud thing that scientists complain about. You know, it's real. And why is it real for these guys, right? It's a one-way street for the pika. Where can they go if you're already at the top of the mountain? You can go a little further, you can go a little further, but once you're at the very top, it's not like you can climb the stairway to heaven there. Well, maybe that's exactly what they're doing. They are going extinct locally. You can't go anywhere. It is a one-way street. And when I keep saying this, it's because extinction is an end. It is not recoverable. No matter what we do to change things in the future, once a species is gone, it is gone forever. And this is just, I use the pika because it's incredibly cute, but you might say, one species that lives in the alpine environment. Well, climate change is fundamentally changing our natural world at a global level. Climate change modifies environments of species, and this can cause massive, massive population declines. If we look at what we would call terrestrial invertebrates, so things that live on land and don't have a vertebral column, insects, spiders, fun things like that, there's been a 45% decline of invertebrate biomass in the past 40 years at a global level. The single best predictor of this is climate change. It turns out that if you look at habitats where the impacts of people has actually gone down, they are still losing species and still losing populations. But you might think of this and, hands up if you're like, I don't like bugs anyway. So spiders, beetles, ugh. Turns out that insects, those kinds of things, are probably the single most important things that convert biomass from plant to animal, which means that they are at the basis of most food chains. And so if you don't like bugs, maybe I can convince you that you should like something like the coqui, this little frog here, or the Puerto Rican toady, which in my opinion is one of the most spectacular birds out there. I mean, just look at that. Notice what they're eating. These things eat insects, birds, reptiles, frogs. They all eat insects. Small mammals eat insects. And if we can look at this graph, it's a little complicated, but if we look at the abundance of these guys in a Puerto Rican rainforest that is more protected today than it was in 1990, more protected today than it was in 1970. We can see their abundance decreasing. Birds decrease. The other thing, get out of here now, sorry. The other thing is that temperatures are also increasing with decreasing populations. The only good explainer of this is temperature increase. That's the only thing, and that is linked to this massive decrease in invertebrate biomass. Okay, so doom and gloom. When we lose the coqui, it's gone. When we lose the Puerto Rican toady, we don't have anything to replace it. We can see it stuffed in museums, and that's it. But it's more than just that. This gradual climate change that is moving things at a slow level, well, it turns out that cataclysmic events can actually wipe out large numbers of species. So if you were not living under a stone, you might know that Australia almost burned last year. In case you don't know, this is a kangaroo, that's a fire. Kangaroos are native to Australia. If you look at Australia over the past 110 years, there has been on average a 2.5 degree increase in annual mean temperature. Most importantly, these temperatures are higher in the summer when there's also no rainfall. Soils get drier, plants get drier. Australia just keeps getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And last year, the fires in Australia burned an area the size of England. Okay, so that is a cataclysmic event. Some parts of Australia, quite frankly, have been doing this for forever, but other parts haven't. In fact, there are areas of tropical rainforest and subtropical rainforest that had not been burned in recorded history, including the oral history of Aboriginal Australians. And these areas burned. Some areas adapted to fire, burned so thoroughly that every single bit of the habitat was destroyed. In the background here, you might not be able to see this. This is a long-nosed potoroo, and it lives in brush outside of Sydney in New South Wales. and its entire habitat was 100% destroyed. We think, except for a small population at a couple of zoos, we might have lost the long-tailed potoroo, the long-nosed potoroo for forever. All right, an estimated 2 to 3 billion animals perished in these fires. Some of them are extinct. So these cataclysmic events are one-way streets for these species. Once they're gone, you will never get the chance to watch a long-nosed potoroo hop through an Australian forest ever again. Okay, so the long-nosed potoroo, well, koalas were significantly impacted, and the current estimates are that we will lose all 3 subspecies of koala by 2050. So there's something. And these cataclysmic events are becoming more and more common. Every single year, they are becoming more and more common. 16 of the 20 largest fires in California's history have occurred in the last 2 years. This is a satellite image of about a month ago when California was burning. You can see it over here. And there were 2 hurricanes simultaneously hitting the southeastern United States. So right now, the Sierras are on fire, and Hurricane Sally just dumped 2 feet of rain in the Gulf Coast. These events are becoming more and more common. So what happens when the events become commonplace? What happens when fire becomes commonplace, when flooding becomes commonplace? Well, we get a massive shift in the entire structure of huge geographic areas. And so what I'm going to talk to you a little bit now is about biome shift in California. Now, a biome is a complex community. Biotic meaning that it's biology, and it's characterized by distinctive plants and animals maintained under climate conditions of the region. So this is when you say a desert or a rainforest or a woodland or a tundra, you're talking about a biome. The most common biomes in Southern California are forest, shown here, oak savanna, shown here, and desert, shown here. How are these all related? Turns out the single biggest predictor of biomes are the interplay between temperature, shown here on the x-axis, and precipitation, shown here on the y-axis. So if you have very cool temperatures and very low precipitation, you have tundra. If you have high temperatures and high precipitation, you have rainforest. California is right here on this axis, where we have boreal and temperate forests as we increase our rainfall, and a little bit cooler. And as it gets warmer, we have woodland and shrubland, and we have temperate grassland and cold desert. What happens if climate changes and the climate gets warmer and rainfall gets less? Which direction do we move on this graph? Oh, where's my little arrow's gone? Well, I will draw it in here with my laser pointer, this direction. We're moving towards deserts. Forests become shrublands. Shrublands become deserts. Now, when we lose those forests, they're gone, right? And the link between a forest and a woodland is fire. So the Southern Sierras are experiencing almost annual fires now. And these beautiful, beautiful woodlands that we have are going to become, forests that we have are going to become woodlands. The woodlands are going to become deserts. This relationship between water and temperature is very, very, very predictable. All right, this is a one-way street for the animals and plants that are found there. California has the highest level of endemic, meaning they're not found anywhere else, species in the entire United States. And we are going to lose them at a massive scale. Okay, you might say, so what? So what? You biologists, you tree-hugging biologists, who cares? It's true, maybe I do care more. I grew up in a time when I could go outside and see nature all over the place. And humans have this amazing ability to adjust. So this is Easter Island here on the left. When Easter Island was first colonized by Polynesians in the 12th century, it had more forested land than any other island in all of the Pacific. In fact, it had some of the largest palms. It had the largest palms in the world, and it was covered by palms that were 15 to 25 meters tall. By the time Europeans arrived in the 18th century, there was not a single plant on the island that was higher than my shoulders. There were no fish right next to the islands because they'd been fished out. And the Polynesians could not go fishing because there was no more wood on the island to construct boats. So when Europeans arrived there, Polynesians thought the Easter Island native people thought that they were the luckiest people on earth because, you know, they had chickens and they had sweet potatoes and they had so many different recipes to cook Polynesian rat. You know, there were no more fish, no more native birds, nothing like that. But boy, they could really eat some rat. And so with that, you know, humans have this amazing ability to adjust, even in this kind of what almost looks like a post-apocalyptic landscape. And so with that, you're going to say, okay, where's the integration here? I'm going to turn this over to Professor Schoonmaker, and she's going to talk to you about exactly these kinds of post-apocalyptic scenarios. All right, Professor Schoonmaker. Let me stop share.
I just realized I was muted. Thank you, Professor Morse. So I'm going to talk about dystopian novels. In the last few years, my students and I have taken a renewed interest in dystopian literature, which is a subgenre of science fiction. I think this interest comes in part from feeling as if the world is changing and shifting in ways that are difficult to grasp. Or as the author Margaret Atwood put it, science fiction is speculative fiction about things that really could happen. The cataclysmic events of the last year have made dystopian novels seem prescient in their predictions. We're here tonight to talk about climate change, which is most often the centerpiece of dystopian novels. Okay, I'm just having trouble getting my next slide up. Okay. So in these novels, the world has been ravaged by climate change or a pandemic, and sometimes both. The settings are always described as gray, ashen, uninhabitable. There are usually two worlds within these novels. One are the privileged people who lived within walled compounds, and the others are living among the ruins. The deserted scene that you're looking at here is reminiscent of a world that has been destroyed. There are no people, no traffic, an ashen sky. In fact, this picture is taken at a Seattle intersection just last week in the aftermath of the fires that have swept the entire West Coast. As Governor California Newsom said, climate change is real. Dystopian novels critique the actions of contemporary society with an emphasis on how people put profit over ethical decisions, especially as it relates to the environment. They critique our sense of entitlement to all the world's resources without thinking of the long-term consequences. In the literature, a world devoid of resources tests the capacity of humankind's ability to survive and then to invent new resources. Let me just admit someone else in. Here are two examples of setting in the novel Orcs and Crake by Margaret Atwood. The world has been decimated by a virus that has been released into the environment. A new species has been created that needs nothing from the earth, but they're also devoid of everything that makes us human. This description from the novel reminds us that we really do need to pay heed to the scientists' warnings, and I'll read it. Still, as time went on and the coastal aquifers turned salty and the northern permafrost melted and the vast tundra bubbled with methane and the drought in the mid-continental plains regions went on, and the Asian steppes turned to sand dunes and meat became harder to come by. This second quote comes from another dystopian novel called The Road by Cormac McCarthy. In this world, a father and son are journeying through a desolate earth where the cannibals and the thieves roam unhindered. Their goal is not just survival, but to survive as the good guys, which is another theme that comes out in dystopian novels. How do you distinguish between whether you're a good guy or a bad guy? And I'll read the quote. Just beyond the high gap in the mountains, they stood and looked out over the great gulf to the south, where the country, as far away as they could see, was burned away, the blackened shapes of rock standing out of the shoals of ash, and billows of ash rising up and blowing down country through the waste. And then one last novel. This comes from a novel called Gold Famed Citrus by Claire V. Watkins. And the title takes its name from the reasons that people migrated to California in the first place. Watkins' critique here is most obvious, and this book was written before the worst fire season in California history, which is 2020. But the sand, all that monstrous, infinite sand, what had latticed the Southwest with a network of aqueducts? Who had diverted the coast's rainwater and sapped the great basins of its groundwater? If this was God, he went by new names: Los Angeles City Council, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, City of San Diego, City of Phoenix. And actually the list goes on, but I won't share the entire list with you. So as Professor Moore said when he started that he was going to talk about the doom and gloom, I'm going to say we're not going to end on a doom and gloom note, because the flip side is that in dystopian novels, when humans are trying to reimagine and rebuild the world they destroyed, they look inward to what they value about being human. The same things always emerge, regardless of the book. Our need for faith, art, science, human interaction, love, intimacy, and community. So to sum up, dystopian literature is created as a warning to pay attention to the urgent challenges facing us today, and to be innovative in our solutions so that we don't end up in the world imagined in these novels. And now I'll pass to Professor Finocchio.
Great, thank you so much, Deborah. Professor Sunmacher. Sorry. I'm Debbie Finocchio, Professor Finocchio, and I teach chemistry, general chemistry this semester. And welcome to our LLC event. And there's one thing that I just want to touch base on before we move forward, and that is, can you double check to make sure that your name that's showing is actually your first and last name? And if it's not, you can go into the little square where your box is, and at the top right, there are 3 dots. You can click on that, and you'll see it says rename if you want to, and you can rename yourself. That will be helpful for us. And then while you're doing that, I just want to remind you, our theme, Innovate, creativity is the power to see things differently. In the context of that, we're looking across disciplines, right? We're doing our practicing first year integration right now. And so you can see that each of our disciplines is providing you with a little bit richer context to think about climate change. And Professor Sunmacher ended on something I thought was really beautiful, is like, really, what do you value in life? What's important to you? And if you just don't mind, I'd like to invite you to take a moment to use your chat and just maybe state one thing that's important to you that you value. To use your chat, down at the bottom, there's a chat thing that you can click to open it up. And you can go ahead and type in on the bottom right and then hit enter. And while you're doing that, I'm going to get my slides up. This is awesome. It looks like there's all kinds of chats coming in, so yay. Morality, friends and family, friends, so important, right? So you can see there's this human connection here that we've got, right? And it's so important that we take care of each other, you know? So in terms of climate change, that's something that we can always be thinking about to help us. How are we gonna help each other out and look positively into the future? So that's one thing that I want to address in the context of what I'm going to talk about. And I want to give you a little, I'm going to close my chat for now, just so I can see a little better. But I'm going to give you just a little bit of a chemistry background to start. So just a little quickie chemistry background. So, and keep in mind, chemistry is all about the molecules, okay? So we have a few basic fundamentals in chemistry. It has to do with the changes in matter, what's happening at the molecular level. And so you might be aware, you might know, oh, gasoline reacts with oxygen in order to make carbon dioxide and water, okay? That's a reaction that happens inside an internal combustion engine when you burn gasoline. Another thing about chemistry that's very fundamental to us is that every chemical has got its own structure, and that structure is going to impact what its physical and chemical properties are. So you might be familiar with carbon dioxide. If you exhale carbon dioxide, that's actually a waste product in your when you metabolize food. When you exhale carbon dioxide, you don't see it. The carbon dioxide itself is colorless. Maybe there's other chemicals that aren't, or sorry, that are odorless. Maybe there's other chemicals that aren't odorless, but the CO2 portion is odorless. It's a gas at room temperature. So these are properties of carbon dioxide. Every chemical has its own properties based upon its structure. And the third thing that's really good for us to know going into this is that some chemical reactions require energy. So when chemicals undergo changes, they might require energy and they might release energy. So one example of one that requires energy is if you were to take water and break it into hydrogen and oxygen, that would require energy. On the reverse side, if you took hydrogen and oxygen and made water out of it, that would release energy. And it's important for us to know that whatever reaction happens in one direction, if it requires energy, whatever that amount it requires, it releases the same amount in the reverse direction. That's a very useful thing for us to know in chemistry. Oh, where'd my slides go? This is strange. Just 1 second. I'm not seeing, it's like my slides are blank. Give me just 1 sec. All right, so I have to tell you something. Right before I hit slideshow, I must have inadvertently hit a button that erased all of my slides. And so I just did that butterfly Z, which is undo. Are you guys familiar with that? That's like my favorite keystroke on the computer. I did butterfly Z a bunch of times and I got all my slides back. Okay, so here we go. So for chemistry, how does a chemist practice science? We use something called the scientific method. And what's really important to think about is that we have a hypothesis, which is a testable guess. And we think about that and we think, okay, well, how can we test this? And then we have to test it and retest it. And we do experimental design. We might have to refine the experiment. We might have to, after we do tests and retest and we analyze our results, we might have to go back and refine the hypothesis. And so this picture here that looks really messy, I actually really like it because it emphasizes the iterative nature of the scientific method and the process that scientists undergo. It's very systematic, but it's very iterative at the same time. So that's something that's really important to us. Excuse me. So I want to talk about 3 innovations. So in the context of creativity is the power to see things differently, these are 3 different scenarios where somebody saw things differently and were able to provide some really great benefit to society, all in the context of chemistry. Very cool. Okay, so the first one has to do with the Nobel Prize that was awarded last year. Every October, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry comes out, and last year's Nobel Prize was awarded to 3 different scientists who came up with and then improved on the lithium-ion battery. And you can see if you look in the picture there, I don't know if you see my mouse, but in the circular portion of it, you can see there's a sun and there's a windmill and there's tides or waves. So it's trying to illustrate, or it's illustrating that those different types of energy sources could go into this storage battery and then be used to, you know, inside your mobile home or your boat or your laptop. So these lithium ion batteries are in all kinds of things. Your laptops and cell phones, those are things that we use all the time, right? They're lightweight, they're rechargeable. You could go ahead and, like it shows in the picture, get energy from not having to burn fossil fuels, and they can store that. So that's just a fantastic thing. So this was a really big deal. And the second innovation that I want to talk about might be good if we talk just briefly, if I show you briefly a little bit of information about just an example of California's greenhouse gas emissions. So you're probably familiar that carbon dioxide is the most abundant greenhouse gas that exists. And so quite often greenhouse gases are talked about in the context of CO2. And you can see from this graph here, this is the most recent data, it's from 2017, that 424 million metric tons of CO2 were emitted in California. That's the estimate. And what I want you to grab from this is that you can see the largest sector is in transportation, second largest sector is industrial, and you have several other areas that are also impacting it. But to me, when I look at that, I think like, wow, transportation, if we could do something with transportation, that could be a really, really impactful thing on society. So the next innovation kind of relates to that. So to give you a little bit of background before we get into that next innovation, I just want to talk briefly about fossil fuels versus hydrogen fuel. And if you have fossil fuels, you probably are familiar, you go to the gas station because the fossil fuels get refined, and they make gasoline, put it at the gas station, and then go ahead and in your car, burn the gasoline, and carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, water, and miscellaneous pollutants are given off, okay? On the other hand, if we were to get some hydrogen, and if you think about, well, where's hydrogen from? And if you think, well, okay, the ocean has a lot of water, that's our biggest source of hydrogen, right? And so in order to get the hydrogen, we're gonna have to take water and split it. That requires energy, right? So we're gonna take the water, use energy to split it to make hydrogen and oxygen, capture the hydrogen, go ahead and have that in some hydrogen, in some fuel tanks. And then when we go ahead and react that reaction gives off energy. And you probably already know from the first slide that the only thing that's produced from it is water, right? You don't have any greenhouse gases produced. You don't have any pollutants produced. So the question is, how are we going to go ahead and split the water? Because it requires energy. You could use fossil fuels to do it, right? But if you don't want to have to use fossil fuels, you can think of other energy sources that exist in the world. There's all kinds of different possibilities, right? So we're going to address that in this next innovation. So innovation number 2 has to do with clean energy. And they used Orkney Islands as an example because Orkney Islands in Scotland is doing this really cool thing where they're generating more clean energy than they can use. So the main part of Scotland, north of there, there's a bunch, like a lot of different islands. There's Orkney Islands, a whole set of islands. There's Shetland Islands north of that as well, other islands. But in the Orkney Islands, there's a fair amount of wind. And then also you're up at the North Sea, you have these like pretty intense tides. So hopefully you can see in the picture there, you've got a community wind turbine, you've got some tidal turbines that can generate some electricity. So that gets pulled in to this, they call it electrolyzer. And that energy, the surplus, they don't need all of it for their community. So the surplus of it is used to generate hydrogen from water. And that's easy to store and easy to transport, right? So they had this problem. How do you store the excess energy? Oh, we can go ahead and convert it into hydrogen, and then we can go ahead and store it and then use it at a later point. So they tried to go ahead and sell it or give it back to the main Scotland. And they're like, no, that's going to be too expensive. We don't want to have to deal with that. So what they decided to do is they're working on this now, and they are converting their ferries to hydrogen fueled. And their goal is to have, in 2021, to have the first hydrogen fueled ferry. and they're retrofitting the existing ferries. So they're not creating new ones, they're retrofitting what they have. It's super interesting. And they said they really want to be a leader in clean energy technologies. And one thing that they're super, super proud of is that the communities there are very small, and they're creating jobs for the young professionals so that people that were leaving to get jobs in large cities are not doing that now. They're staying in the small towns. So it's also having the benefit of, societal benefit as well. And I wanted to choose that one for those reasons, and because it illustrates so many different types of energy that is can be used, right, instead of fossil fuels. But the other thing I want to emphasize is that they're using energy sources that are local. So different countries, different areas are going to have potentially different sources that are going to be better for them. And a combination of sources you can see is a good way to go. It's not like only this is good or only that is good. There's combination that's nice. So the third and final innovation has to do with access to clean water. And you may or may not know, but a lot of people in the world do not have access to clean water right now. You can see here the World Health Organization and UNICEF did a joint report here. 1 in 3 people globally do not have access to safe drinking water. And there's a huge water scarcity problem. 4 in 10 people in the whole world are already impacted by water scarcity. Excuse me. And you can imagine that who is affected by this most, people that are living in poverty are going to be affected by this most. And you can also imagine that as climate change continues, it's going to be harder and harder to get clean water. And so this innovation, this last innovation that I want to talk about has to do with something called metal organic frameworks. They call them MOFs for short. The reason I chose this is because it's really significant in chemistry. You can see it's a top 10 chemical innovation that's going to change our world, according to the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry. Some chemists were making these metal organic frameworks to sponge up or suck up other molecules. And they serendipitously noticed, gosh, this is trapping water really, really well. And so they started thinking about it, and they're like, wow, could we actually use these things in order to trap water in dry climates? Because they're really sponging up the water really well. And so they went ahead and tested it. What they found out is, yeah, they could. And so 1 kilogram, or about 2.2 pounds of metal organic framework can actually harvest 2.8 liters a day. So the 2-liter water bottles, right, per day. Humidity as low as 20%. And that's significant because in an arid or very dry, like deserty climate, in the night, the humidity will actually get up to around 30%. And so this is like a reasonable thing to happen. And then the metal organic framework can release the water at 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And you might think like, oh, that's requiring energy to get the water out of it. But if you think about this, it's like, well, and this is what they proposed, is you just go ahead and set it next to a, I don't know, like a dryer or the back of your refrigerator, or something else that's already giving off waste heat. And that waste heat can be used to go ahead and release the water from the metal organic framework. So that's all I wanted to talk about for this evening. And I want to pass it off to Professor Sullivan. And I will stop screen sharing just a second.
Well, thank you, Professor Finocchio, Sunmacher, and Morse, for pretty much making whatever I have to say a lot less important. That was pretty amazing, right? However, I think what I have to say might be important when it comes to public communication, public knowledge about climate change. As much as it may seem for just about everyone here, I would hope that this is an obvious thing. In fact, facts are being debated about climate change as we speak, of course. And what I think communication studies, particularly media studies, might have to offer, well, there are many things. I'm going to focus, to begin with, on news coverage to start. And for about 100 years, news coverage, mainstream news coverage in the US, has emphasized what's called normative press theory, or social responsibility theory. So since the 1920s, with the New York Times actually pioneering this approach, the idea is to provide these 3 basic functions towards a democratic society. In other words, how might news as the public communication function contribute to the material that a citizenry discusses. To this end, media play the forum, kind of like a large town hall in which people discuss ideas that matter. Of the three functions here, I'm going to emphasize the marketplace of ideas. The watchdog function is watching over people in power. So those in government, those with wealth. The representation function is, again, more detail. It has to do with the journals being the public's representative. The marketplace of ideas, in a way, is meta to all that. The basic idea from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty is the analogy to the marketplace, a free and open marketplace, where you have the best ideas there, even with everything else thrown in. If you allow those ideas to percolate, to be discussed, then a rational public will then settle on the best of these. So it underpins our democratic processes with the idea being eventually the majority wins out, and the majority is guided by rational thought and, of course, by facts, right? Emotions play a role, to be sure. People's own interests and community interests play a role. But in the end, the marketplace ideas function is the media's role in part is to provide a full range of ideas on a given issue. And obviously, I'm going to address climate change, and particularly global warming in this regard. But it has been a tenet and a chief tenet of mainstream American news. And I would argue we're saying goodbye to that. That is about 100 years, and now we're starting to see part of the old industrial society, in this case, industrial society media, give way to the internet and, of course, to a challenge to this one-to-many and mass communication idea. A second idea that's related to this is that comm studies students in particular recognize that communication in a public forum takes the shape of its technological expression. That is, the quality and, more importantly, the character of the ideas that we discuss or become part of our discourse in a society is shaped by the medium. And hence, when we go from oral culture to print culture, and then in the 20th century, electronic culture, and now a post industrial society and post-electronic culture society, one defined increasingly by not one-to-many, but network communication. We change the character of our expression. And hence, one of the key ideas here is that media are epistemology. That is, media shape what we think we know and how we know them. Right? And as I mentioned, these shifts occur according to the dominant media of the day. So right now, we're all undergoing a revolution in media. Not simply a different kind of dominant medium, but one entirely different in character. The internet being the dominant driver of this, but it's very different from the electronic era defined by broadcast media. It's not one-to-many, it's network, it's digital, and a whole host of other factors come into play with this. So those two things are important because they affect the marketplace ideas fundamentally. So one point I want to note here is from the BBC, that they noted that last spring there was a rapid increase worldwide in news coverage and news access. That is, people became news junkies, in part because they were at home, right, or they had to stay put, and in part because of the media available, right? That is a variety of ways of accessing news, right? But they also note in this piece, this is from spring 2020, that of course the mainstream news aren't the only sources to access. And of course, streaming services, radio, social media, podcasting, various websites, and of course, especially social media, all provide what they say, an environment in which we're in a constant soup of news from the morning we wake up to the moment we close our eyes each night. And so we're bombarded with information. Other scholars like Bill McKibben, who is a naturalist, who has studied in part media influence on our perceptions of the natural environment, has called this the age of missing information, because we have too much and can't correlate it and make sense of it. So I'm just reminded that the BBC story here still applies to our environment today. That is, we're bombarded by information, and that all kind of, here are the central media that provide us generally most of the information we need to know. They're just one source among many, right, that people routinely access today for the information. Right? So just on Friday, here are two separate stories about the fires in Oregon, which were unique. As Dr. Morse has pointed out, that this is a cataclysmic event, and never before in recorded history have fires of this type taken place west of the Cascades. And one story is from the Associated Press describing what was taking place on Thursday, September 10th. As for the roaring winds that night, scientists say that they were the equivalent of the notorious Santa Anas of Southern California. The appearance in the rainforest of these fires in the Pacific Northwest is almost certainly due to climate change, according to researchers. Versus on the same day, this same story, this case CNN, you could find this from the Associated Press as well, that authorities in Oregon are pleading with the public to only trust information verified by official sources, right, as unprecedented wildfires about to say. The pleas come as law enforcement agencies were reporting that 911 dispatchers were being overrun with calls about false online rumors about how Antifa members have been arrested for setting the fires. This is a claim spread by the so-called QAnon anonymous account, right behind many conspiracy theorists. The incident highlights how online conspiracy theories, right, a sustained effort by right-wing campaigns to create increased fear of anti-fascist groups, and are amplified by QAnon followers, have real consequences. So on the one hand, someone could say, hey, here's a report from mainstream media, and it's telling us basically what's going on. And we need to know, it's a safety issue. Not to mention, it's reinforcing, right, problems of climate change. And at the very same time, there are people who then don't apparently get that message or discount that message in favor of a social media message on their own little networks, their own bubbles that perpetuate, right, a conspiracy theory that has no grounding whatsoever in fact. This has become much more the case in the public discourse than was the case in the one-to-many or the mass comm age. You would have extreme groups and extreme messages. They would not have entered into the mainstream conversation and therefore have real-world consequences that complicate discussions about, for example, what do we do about climate change? This slide shows a poll from the Pew Charitable Trust in their research group that shows that most adults in the US say that climate change is a problem, that the government should in fact do more about it. Yet on the other hand, barely half feel confident in the way news media or their neighbors. This is the third person effect. So no, I'm not affected by false information, but my neighbor might be, right? That's called the third person effect. But in this case, I thought was really interesting is barely half trust the media. And even worse, although it might be in here, yeah, if you look at this column here, confidence in the news media, right, is even less than confidence in journalists in general. Now, I find that really interesting. In other words, who is a journalist? People in this poll might have been responding to those who strictly report via Twitter, for example, or via part of their Facebook groups even, or even say patch, or very local kind of so-called reporting. And so you see the overall decrease in respect in terms of trust for the media in general. So I find that kind of interesting as well. And then, as one might expect, there is a split, a partisan split. So this forum for the discourse about ideas that matter in a democratic and free and open society certainly is shaped by a variety of sources. These include media ones, right? So here I'm really talking about just media as one influence among many, right? It's overdetermined, right? This is what Foucault called overdetermination. But it's an important one, and it's a consistent one. And as the trust in media declines, then other sources substitute, including non-factual ones that go right against the grain of mainstream media since the 1920s. They go right against the grain of the so-called quality of the marketplace ideas. So we may have more ideas. We don't have consensus. We don't have enough, perhaps, people focusing on the good ideas. And here you see this also is reflected in partisanship. So just in terms of political affiliation, you see a real clear distinction here, say between Democrats, registered Democrats, who think the federal government is doing too little to address climate change, whereas you see this big difference between Republicans, who tend to be much more divided on that. So it is 90% of Democrats who say, yeah, the government needs to do more, is a big divide to Republicans who are really divided on this, right? So not a majority of Republicans say this isn't an issue, but overall, you're seeing a big difference between party affiliation just on this one issue. And of course, as you might expect, that then contributes to how people access media. In other words, their partisanship or their predispositions certainly shape which media they access. If you have a predisposition towards a certain point of view, then you tend to reinforce that predisposition by accessing information that you already agree with. This is something Paul Lazarsfeld, political scientist, demonstrated in the 1940s. And although our media environment is much more complicated today, the same principle applies, right? So in other words, why would a conversation about something we all know to be true right now, right, is so difficult to hold? That is, why can't we kind of agree on something, at least nationally? And keep in mind, we're one of the few big nations that's pulled out of the Paris climate, right, change, climate talks and agreements, because we are so divided. Well, a big reason, again, has to do with what source of information people seek. So, for example, this is from Pew, again, the Pew Trust research, that they demonstrated that the tendency for those who identify as Republican to rely on fewer sources, and especially on one mainstream source, in this case, Fox News, clearly is different from those who say they're Democrat. And the chief finding here for me is, you look at those who are Democrats tend to trust CNN and watch CNN are, somewhat equivalent from their Republican counterparts who trust, right, Fox News, right? That is, it's almost opposite right here. It's almost an either or, right? And so what do you find? You're going to find those who already gravitate towards material that they already think is likely to be true. They continue with those sources. And then you look at the differences here in other sources, and find that there is a really big difference in the number of sources. It may not be indicated here, but the tendency is for those who think climate change is an issue, they access many sources of information. Those who don't think it's an issue tend to gravitate toward very, very few. And that is, I think, the big problem here. Okay, so I don't think I'll have time to go over all this, but I'm going to go to an old goodie, and that's media agenda setting theory, because media agenda setting theory helps us understand what has been when it comes to how media shape that public forum for discussion that underlies democracy, and perhaps why we're leading away from that to more fragmented discourse and then ignoring facts, and where facts don't matter as much as perhaps feelings and predispositions. This is a model of agenda setting posed by McCombs and Shaw from 1972. The keys here for me are understanding that gatekeeping is a function of professional journalism, according to McCombs and Shaw. So what they argued was that you have this professionalization in which journalists learn, here's what normative press theory is, here's the marketplace ideas, watch how function representation. Your job is to inform the public. Okay? I think we're losing this. That is, this is getting fragmented, where anyone can become a gatekeeper, anyone can become a journalist. You have a modem and you have Facebook, you're now a journalist if you want to be. So that means we lose that kind of consensus in the whole professionalization of the field. The second thing I think is important to note about this is that the basic model that media set the agenda. So what to think about is important. Hey, the more that media report it, the more the public thinks it's important. That's the basic agenda setting model. It doesn't tell people what to think, but what the people should think about. So there's a correlation there. You poll people, the public, what do they think is important to think about? It more or less correlates with what's there in media as most important. Since 2000, even before then, in the late 1990s, obviously the internet affected this, especially social media, because now you have a variety of sources. So it gets fragmented in terms of sourcing. It also gets fragmented in terms of what people then say is important to them. And while some of these sources get correlated, what I would point out is right in here where people say, no, this is what I rely on, gets fragmented. In other words, people can just rely on certain sources, not so-called mainstream sources. So they can put themselves in what people call a bubble. This illustration of this graph is a pretty good example of this kind of ability for people to just skip over what might be mainstream. I'm not suggesting that the truth about climate change is here or what to do about climate change is here, but nonetheless, where you put yourself, whether it's electoral politics or otherwise ideologically, means these are the sources you're more likely to access. And so, just for example, if you go down and to the left, yeah, people might be more progressive or liberal here, but as they go out on this graph, they become less and less beholden to facts and more emotion and more simply political. The same goes on this side, where you have sources such as InfoWars from the early 2000s, one of the first YouTube sites that express conspiracy theories, and now OOAN, right, as a so-called cable news source, and others are in here too. So you really do find people now going away from the center in mainstream sources into these extremes via a variety of sources. Okay, so I'm going to skip over that. I'm going to go right to here, and that is, in a post-fact society thesis idea means that we lose kind of a sense of fact driving, right, the public discussion. Emotion has always been important. Professor Sundman mentioned, for example, dystopian work. How dystopian work has given rise to much more interest today. And in Intro to Media Studies, we actually study how dystopian novels now give rise to films and series that influence people, that get them talking about climate change. But on the other hand, right, it changes the character of discourse and collective action in ways that are difficult to access today. It's difficult for us to get a handle on the way that the fragmentation of media and audiences changes the quality of our discourse, right? Because the medium shapes the message, right? So I end up with this point about the bubbles, right? So you could end up within very discrete bubbles that, again, reflect the points of view you already agree with, the people you already agree with, and the facts be darned. Just don't need those. It's going to be shaped by very narrow agendas. But those very narrow interests can then get amplified across, especially social media today, and thus affect the marketplace of ideas. Okay, I want to end up with something positive because this is where Professor Finocchio was. And I went back to doom and gloom again. But hey, the great things about especially the internet is you do have a voice, right? That, okay, there are no not gatekeepers today, there are gatekeepers, but you can be the media. In fact, this is something we teach students in comm studies. You are the media, so that you don't have to rely on a publisher, a studio, a corporation to get your ideas out. You can be the influencer. And of course, that encourages public participation, so that we see this all the time where people can engage in that public discourse by organizing themselves, right? And hence that can shape the public agenda away from perhaps, especially corporate media might have different interests. And then what I call netizens, right, can take agency in shaping these responses, including to climate change. And I think we see that happening today. Okay, so I know we're out of time, so I'm gonna leave it there.
Okay. Well, we don't have a lot of time for a panel discussion. I think all of the professors here are willing to stay longer. I'll speak for myself and and maybe for everybody else here too. And I wanted to open it up to people to comment. You can ask questions either in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can call on you in the and you can ask verbally. Yes, here's one from Kiara. Go ahead, Kiara.
So I was wondering, because I learned a lot about like climate change through my AP environmental class last year. So I was wondering, like, on a personal level, what can we do for ourselves to lower our carbon footprint?
Absolutely. You know, I think that Professor Finocchio talked a little bit about that with looking to, you know, alternative forms of carbon neutral energy, you know, which are there. You know, one of the, you know, maybe I could pass this one off to her to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think one way, I mean, I think if you think of it, if I think of it from a chemistry perspective, and I'm thinking about, it's all about the molecules, and that basically to get any product, it's going to require energy to do that, right? So one is whatever energy I'm going to use, it could be good if I can try to do something that's not going to contribute to extra CO2 into the atmosphere. And then another thing just to consider is, do I really need that product to begin with? Because if it's going to require energy to make it, I better value it, you know? So that's something that I think is kind of useful to think about. And so the things that are important to you and the things that you value, you know, keep doing those things. But maybe there's certain things in your life, and everybody will have their own unique combination of things. Maybe there's some things that are less important. So when we're not in our, you know, COVID-19 situation, when I'm going to USD every day, I take the train. So public transportation is one thing that a person can do, right? We have a hybrid vehicle. We're a one-car family, so we try to minimize our impact in that regard. Quite often, well, these days it's sitting in the garage all the time, but quite often it's sitting in the garage anyway. So that kind of thing. And so I think each person can just kind of think about, you know, what are things that we do in our everyday life that can minimize that, and what the choices that we make, you know. So, and again, it'll be different for every person. So I'm happy to talk with you more too out at a later time if you'd like.
Yeah, and Kiara, I would say that awareness, you know, just being aware of what you do on a daily basis as it relates to the carbon cycle, right? You know, we do have to do things that consume energy, but if we consume the energy that is already there, primarily from sunlight, so wind, solar, wave energy, hydrogen, right? And we're not releasing fossil fuels to increase the amount of carbon into the atmosphere. You know, that awareness, and I think that speaks to Professor Sullivan's as well, the awareness of what can be done, the design of cities, right? How we move from one place to another, how industry sees disposability of their products. So these are things that, you know, they can be consumer driven as well. Let's see, we have Cameron Parker, Professor Parker.
Hey, thank you very much, everyone. It's wonderful. And great question, Kara. Just kind of piggybacking on that is, I always wonder with this sort of bad news kind of thing, how do you pitch it? And I think this is something for all of you, in a way that both feels like it's bad enough, you got to do something, but not so bad that it's best just to curl in the fetal position, do nothing, or there's nothing, it's too late. If there's nothing we can do, then don't do anything. I mean, so how do you sort of balance your message between those two extremes?
I have an opinion, but if Professor Sullivan or Schumacher wants to go, that is such a great point. I vacillate between being incredibly pessimistic, because I do see, we are speeding up climate change. We are actually increasing fossil fuel. But then I become very, very optimistic when I interact with students who are very aware of this and care very deeply. And it's your world that we're messing up right now, right? I'm going to die before most of you guys are even, kind of at my point. So, the optimism and the activism that I see in young people who want a better world for themselves, I think that can be very, very, very strong. So, and it can be done. It can be done. That's the cool thing about this. We have the technologies today. If we can make the investments in those technologies and implement them, will it take a massive, migration-inducing, cataclysmic series of years before we do something about it? That's how we tend to act. But maybe not, maybe we can act before we do that. But it's a great question. I wish I knew the answer.
I think it sounds like a really great question for like an essay or a paper, right? Super thought-provoking. And I think it's important to go back to what you value, things that people value, their friends, their family. People mention their education, opportunity, things like that. And then the question becomes, well, do I do nothing or do I do something? Do I have hope? You have to have hope for the future, right? So that would be my response. And I love the question. I think it's just wonderful because this is such an overwhelming burden that we're placing on the future. It's so huge.
Yeah. Speaking of future, we got some good questions in the chat too.
I was about to say, we have a couple of good questions from Becca. Over time, do you believe it could be possible for species to adapt to the warmer climates and possibly survive them? Or would species die off before this could be possible? That is such a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful question. And we look at, we can actually look at evolutionary biology and paleoclimatology to do this. And what we see is at those times in the past when climates have changed at a pace that does not even approach where we are pacing now, is mass extinction. That's what we see. Yes, some species will absolutely have the thermal tolerances to deal with this. There will be genetic variation in heat shock proteins and in thermal tolerances that will allow them to persist. And then, millions of years down the line, when humans are extinct, start a new, radiation. But, what does that mean for my children and my grandchildren? Is that a world devoid of things that didn't have the opportunity to exist? I heard someone say, who cares if polar bears go extinct? And I just thought, I don't want a world where there are no polar bears. I have to admit it. I just, the thought of being able to maybe plan a trip to Alaska to see polar bears is exciting to me. So, it is a really good question. The evidence tells us that is very unlikely. We have another one from Tiffany. What is your opinion on DNA editing to save endangered species? Whew. Wow, now we're getting into a whole ball of ethics. Yeah, maybe Tiffany, maybe we can actually talk about that in our class when we get to CRISPR. I like the question though, because that is an ethical dilemma. or we could talk about it now. It's in the same boat as what Becca asked. You know, what is one way that we could speed up evolution, right? Introducing genetic variation. I don't know. That's another discussion. You know what? It is late. Some of you probably have midterms tomorrow. Not my class. We had it yesterday. So some of you might have it tomorrow. So we should probably wrap this up. I want to thank all of our panelists, Professor Finocchio, Professor Sudenmacher, and Professor Sullivan, and all of you students for coming in. This was fun.